What if God couldn't prevent evil because he's just not strong enough? What if God isn't as powerful as we thought? Let's consider. Hello philosophers, I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. I'd like to start this video by first acknowledging an issue with names. I realize that Mormon and LDS are not terms that the LDS want me to use. And I sincerely want to be respectful, and I want to adhere to the wishes of others. So I honestly apologize, but I'm going to use those terms anyway. This video isn't the place to talk about why that is. I wrote a post about it on my website, thephilosopher.com, and I'll link to it in the description. With that, let's get into the video. Several years ago, my wife's uncle Randy died of cancer. And he was the pride and joy of Albuquerque. He was the drummer for Ozzy Osbourne, Randy Castillo. He also played for Lita Ford and Motley Crue after Tommy Lee left. Everybody loved him. There were movies made about him after he passed. So it was really heartbreaking when he died. In fact, my wife's grandmother refused to go to church for years afterwards. She got so mad at God for letting that happen. Why was she so mad? Well, because she believed that God could have prevented Randy from dying. You know, God could have healed him of that cancer. But obviously he didn't, and she felt that he should have. But what if God couldn't help it? What if he just didn't have the power to do it? Would she still be mad? As I've explained on previous episodes, the problem of evil is an objection to the existence of God. It states that, one, if God exists, then he could prevent evil because he's all-powerful and all-knowing. Two, if God exists, then he would prevent evil because he's all good. So, if God exists, then evil does not exist. But evil exists, therefore God does not exist. And the reason I gave you for believing premise one was that God is all-powerful and all-knowing. Here's a little bit more technical view of that. Assume 6, that God exists. Well then 7, God is all-knowing. And 8, evil is something to know how to prevent. Therefore 9, God knows how to prevent evil. 10, God is all-powerful. 11, evil is something to have the power to prevent. Therefore 12, God has the power to prevent evil. 13, an agent can prevent something if she knows how to do it and has the power to do it. Therefore 14, if God exists, he could prevent evil. Now interestingly, the LDS has a really radical view on God. It is totally different from the traditional Jewish, Christian, and Muslim view of God. Mormons believe that God is an exalted man. They believe that God was once a human just like you and me. He had his own God, and through his obedience to that God decided to make him a God. He gave him the ability to make his own universe from pre-existent matter that is eternal, matter that has always existed, never began to exist. They call it inchoate matter, meaning matter that's just sort of blobby, it has no actual properties to it. And again, that's what we are. So if we're very obedient to God, then we can also become gods and have our own universes. Of course, that brings up the question, what about this other God? Our God's God. Did he have a God? Yes. The LDS believes that he had a God who had a God who had a God ad infinitum. And they call this doctrine the doctrine of eternal progression, an infinite chain of gods. Now, if that's the case, is the God of Mormonism like the God of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam? Well, yes and no. Traditionally, it's held by those three religions that God is omniscient, that he knows all things. Mormonism believes the same thing. They believe that God is omniscient. There are differing views as to whether God knows future free will events, much like open theism, which we talked about in a previous episode, but others believe that he knows everything there is to know. And let's assume for the sake of this video, the latter, just because it's going to make things simpler, and we've already covered open theism, which is very similar. However, again, traditionally in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, God is omnipotent, meaning he has unlimited power, infinite power. Mormons do not agree. Now, before we go any further, we're going to have to clarify terms. Traditionally, the word omnipotent has meant the same thing as all-powerful, which has meant infinite amount of power or an unlimited amount of power. Now, the LDS does not believe that God has an unlimited amount of power. It does not believe that he has infinite power. However, they use these terms all-powerful and omnipotent in different ways than they're traditionally used. The word all-powerful they have redefined as meaning can eventually accomplish all his purposes. The word omnipotent, sometimes they use to mean infinite amount of power, in which case they say God does not have that kind of omnipotence, an infinite amount of power. And sometimes they use that word omnipotent to mean the same thing as all-powerful, which is very confusing. So we're not actually going to use this word omnipotent in that way. I think using the word all-powerful in this way is also very confusing, and here's why. Assume that all-powerful means can accomplish all of his purposes? Well, the LDS believes that God is omniscient, knows everything. So he knows what he can and what he cannot achieve. Well, if he knows what he can't achieve, of course he's not going to aim for that, right? He's only going to aim at the things that he can achieve. But then, of course, he's going to accomplish all the things that he can achieve because that's the only things that he aimed at. But then anybody who sets as their goals only things that they can achieve is going to be considered all-powerful, right? I mean, like a cat who only went after lame birds. That cat would always be able to get those birds, so that cat would never fail in its goals. But we don't want to say that a cat is all-powerful. So I think this word all-powerful ends up being kind of an empty term if we define it this way. And for that reason, let's distinguish these terms. I'm going to use the words omnipotent and all-powerful in the traditional sense, meaning infinite amount of power or maybe an unlimited amount of power. And when I use the term LDS all-powerful, I'll mean just the most powerful being in this universe. I don't really know if God is more powerful than the other gods. I mean, it brings up an interesting question. If God was created by a different God, did that God transfer some of his power over to this God? You know, do the gods get weaker as they create new ones? And this is not, by the way, actually, I guess it would be an interesting question, because if you have an infinite number of gods and each one of them has given even a part of his power to the next God, then they would have zero power. So it's got to be the case that they're drawing on some kind of unlimited power somewhere, I guess. And actually, if there is an unlimited power, that would mean that there is a possibility of omnipotence. I don't really know. That's a question that I haven't actually explored. Maybe we'll explore it sometime. In any case, it's clear that the Mormon God couldn't be omnipotent for a couple of reasons. First of all, the fact that there are multiple gods, an infinite number of gods, really. But the fact that there are multiple gods means that if two of them had an infinite amount of power and they ever clashed, you'd have some kind of contradiction. Two beings that had all power over each other, even though they were all powerful, that's just a contradiction in terms. Likely, since these gods are all good, they're always going to be of one accord, right? They're always, going to have the same kind of good goals. So they wouldn't actually come into contest with each other. But this is more like a metaphysical point. They both couldn't have infinite power because, in theory at least, if they were to come into conflict, then you would have a contradiction. Also, God was a created being, and being a created being comes along with certain limitations. For example, his power didn't always exist, so it couldn't be infinite, at least in the temporal sense. And these aren't objections, by the way, to the Mormon view of God. This is, if you are going to believe that God began to exist at some point in time, was created by some other God, then you can't believe that that God is omnipotent. So obviously, it makes sense. But if God's not omnipotent, looking back at that support argument for premise 1, look at premise 10. Premise 10 totally revolves around that view of God as all-powerful, being infinite amount of power. But the LDS doesn't believe that God has an infinite amount of power. So the problem of evil isn't even a problem. God didn't prevent all evil because he could not. He didn't have the power. Now, this response by the LDS is very interesting because it actually takes us out of the problem of evil and brings us right back to that original question of why is there evil in the first place? In the first video of my Philosophy of Evil series, I laid out 4 possible kinds of answers that we can give to that question, why is there evil? We could be looking for some kind of purpose for evil. The answer could be some kind of natural law that accounts for evil. We could answer this question by saying, well, evil exists, but there is no explanation. It's an absurd thing. And we could say that evil just doesn't exist. It seems like it does, but it really doesn't. Now, the LDS answer in general denies the first kind of answer, though we'll see that there are some purposes that the LDS God has for some evils. In general, it's not that he has a purpose for evil, it's that he couldn't help evil existing. So what kind of answer are we going to get to this question? Why is there evil? Well, the LDS believes that God didn't create evil, it just always existed. Which brings up some further questions. What is evil then? Is evil some kind of force like gravity that exists out there? Is there some kind of cosmic law that pre-existed all the gods, like in the Euthyphro dilemma? Is it not really a thing at all, but each god gets to pick what he wants as good and evil in his own universe? In any case, coming back to this original question of why is there evil in the first place, I don't know that there is one right answer out there for the LDS, which is not a problem. I mean, there are all kinds of unanswered questions in all the religions. So, it's nothing against them. I'm just saying that they don't have here's our doctrine. This is exactly what evil is. But maybe I'm wrong. And if I am, please let me know in the comments. I'd really appreciate it. That'd be awesome. But now let's look back at the problem of evil and see, What do we think? Does the LDS response to the problem of evil work? Now, I have to say that I don't think this possibility works for reasons that I can't really get to in this video, but that I will definitely explore in future philosophy of religion videos. First, I think the eternal progression of gods is impossible. Second, I don't think we have any reason to believe in finite gods. And third, I think we have several good reasons to believe in an infinite God. However, this video is more about the following question. If this view works, then does it solve the problem of evil? And in that case, I would say, in a way, definitely. I mean, there is no why would God allow this to happen when he just couldn't help it. However, once we press a little further, I think there is a different problem. The problem of evil for people who believe that God is infinite is why would that God that's got control over everything allow evil to exist? And the typical answer is he must allow for that evil because he can bring good things from it. And exactly what good things those are and why he couldn't do it without the evil, we'll explore later. Now, the LDS has argued that there are no good reasons for an omnipotent God to allow evil. Now, we've said that the LDS God is not omnipotent, but even so, he had enough power to take inchoate matter and reform it into a very vast universe. Surely it wouldn't be difficult for him to do stuff like stop major earthquakes, right? I mean, he's omniscient, so he would know that they're happening. And he's got enough power to reform stuff, so it doesn't seem like it would be all that tough for him to stop those kinds of things from happening. Why doesn't he? Well, the LDS response is that he has good reasons for allowing some evil things to happen. But wait a second, that was the answer for the person who believes that God is infinite. That God could prevent evil, but he allows it for some good reason. I think the LDS objection is really this, that being an omnipotent being means that you can do anything, including bringing all goods using no evils. But I think that's a misunderstanding of the concept of omnipotence. Omnipotence doesn't mean can do anything that we can formulate into a sentence. I don't know if you've heard of this counterexample to omnipotence, but some people will present this, could God create a rock so heavy that even he couldn't lift it? And they say that either way you answer this question is a problem for omnipotence. If God can create it, then that means that there's something that he can't do, which is to lift this rock. If God can't create it, then that means there's something that he can't do, which is create this rock. Either way, there's something that God can't do, therefore there's a problem with the concept of omnipotence. Really, it reminds me of, I have 3 children, and the 2-year-old really doesn't get all these things, but I have a 12-year-old and a 6-year-old, and whenever we play, my 6-year-old loves to say stuff like, I've got armor on that nothing can break through. And then I say something like, oh, that's crazy because I have a gun that shoots through exactly that kind of armor. Well, now what doesn't make sense? His armor or my gun? Really, it's my gun, right? I mean, what I just said was contradictory. I said, this gun can break through things it can't break through. And that's the same thing with this idea of the rock, right? We're saying it can't be lifted by something that can lift it. But that's a contradictory concept. It's an empty concept. It's much like saying God couldn't create a Momrath. And I say, what's a Momrath? You say, well, nothing. What? God couldn't create a nothing? What are you even talking about at this point? It's like your sentence left a blank at the end. So you haven't formed a complete sentence. It looks grammatically correct, and yet it holds this, empty term in the back. So sure, God can't do contradictory things, but that's because they don't make sense, not because there's some limitation to God's power. And in the same way, when we say God is omnipotent, that doesn't mean that he could bring about good things that require the potential for evil to exist. Without the potential for evil to exist, that doesn't make any sense. So possibly there are some good things that require the potential for evil to exist. And the LDS admits that. They say that the LDS God allows for some evils to exist because the goods that come from that require that evil to exist. And I think that's a very respectable response, but what it shows, I think, is that the God is not omnipotent response doesn't really get us anywhere. We're still going to have to go to this place where we say that God must have some good reason for allowing some evils to exist. That's all I have for this video. Thank you very much for watching this far. I hope this video has been helpful in garnering understanding. Please feel free to leave comments that are constructive criticism. I'd really appreciate it, and positive feedback. Always love that. That's all I got for today. Adios.